Hello everybody. Today we continue the Sustainability Lunch Talk cycle with another webinar, this time dedicated to the first of the Sustainable Development Goals, namely poverty eradication. I am Laurent Bétry and I'm the Sustainability Officer at the University of Luxembourg, and I am responsible for integrating sustainability into the operations and functioning of the university. One of the facets of my action is to raise awareness of the university community on the different themes of sustainability. And this series of discussion has been developed with the help of the University Sustainability Coordination and Expertise Group, and is intended for everyone, committed or not. So it aims to set the record straight in the mass of information about sustainability, and this is why we invite recognized researchers in the field to inform us in a short, interactive format about the contribution of science to the issues we wish to address. So today we propose to approach sustainability through the lens of the Sustainability Development Goals, and in particular the first of them, which sets the objective of eradicating poverty in all its forms everywhere in the world by 2030. Sustainability is not only ecological, but also and above all social. Eradicating poverty, that is ensuring that everyone has access to basic resources such as food, water, health, education, or decent livelihoods, means enabling everyone to free themselves from unsustainable practices or behaviors, which then lead to environmental degradation, overconsumption, or the use of cheaper means of production. Thus, by fighting poverty, society strengthens its cohesion and resilience, creating the conditions of coexistence that is fairer, more supportive, and therefore more sustainable. This Sustainability Lunch Talk will discuss the status of this objective in Europe and in Luxembourg, what is poverty in our rich countries, and what is the path to its eradication in the Grand Duchy. To talk about this, we have two guests who are specialists of these issues. First of all, Professor Conchita D'Ambrosio, who is Professor of Economics at the Faculty of Humanities, Education and Social Sciences of the University. Professor D'Ambrosio has been Pearl Chair of the Research Program of Socio-Economic Inequalities and is member of the Scientific Council of STATEC and of the Institute of Advanced Studies of the university. She's also a member of the university's Sustainability Coordination and Expertise Group that I mentioned before. Her research is focused on individual and social well-being and its determinants, such as economic insecurity, multidimensional poverty, relative deprivation, resilience, and social exclusion. And we have also Professor Philip van Kerm, who is on a joint assignment as Professor of Social Inequality and Social Policy at FHSE, and the Living Conditions Department at the Luxembourg Institute of Socio-Economic Research, the LISER. His research interests are in applied microeconometrics, welfare and labor, with particular reference to poverty, and income distribution dynamics, wealth inequality, social mobility, social protection, and social policy. Now that the presentations are done, Conchita, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laurent, for your kind introduction, and thanks to everybody for being here. And we share this talk with Philippe. I'm going to start, and then Philippe is going to continue. So we're going to talk about the first Sustainable Development Goals and the part of the 17 goals. And under the aegis of the United Nations, on September 25th, 2015, member states, civil society, the private sector, the scientific community, and international development organization adopted this set of 17 goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think these 17 goals are very important because they stress that to have a sustainable society, we don't really need to have sustainable environment, in the sense we don't really need to look for climate action, life below low water, life on lands, the bottom part of the sustainable goals, but we need really to have a development that is economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable. So the 17 goals, they really embrace different topics, from no poverty to quality education, to gender equality, to no inequality. And the way they are, and this is known as the Agenda 2030, so everybody in the world, all countries by 2030, they need to achieve these 17 goals. And the way the way the goal works is that in each of them, there is a set of targets that specify what we really need to do by 2030. And let's have a look together at the goals of Target 1, no poverty. So by 2030, we need to eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living on less than $125 a day. By 2030, reduce at least by half the proportion of everybody that is in poverty according to national definitions. We need to implement appropriate social protection policy. We need to ensure that the poor have equal rights to economic resources and control of economic resources, including access to natural resources, appropriate new technology, and financial services. We need to build resilience of the poor and those in vulnerable situations and reduce their exposure to shocks and disasters. And the last two targets, they are more in terms of the fact that we need to mobilize resources to reach these goals from a variety of sources. And we also need to create sound policy framework at all levels to eradicate poverty. So we're going to focus on the first two targets of goal number 1, end poverty in all its form everywhere. And in the measurement of poverty, what is incredibly important is the setting of the poverty line. That is that amount of resources, the threshold, that determines whether somebody is living in poverty or not. And the first, $125 a day, is the international poverty line. Instead, the second target is focusing on national definition. So we have a common international poverty line to eradicate extreme poverty, but each country, of course, Luxembourg included, has its own national poverty line, and each country by 2030 needs to reduce at least by half the proportion of poor that are in poverty according to national definitions. So let's have a look together at these two poverty lines, the international poverty line that sometimes we're going to call it as the IPL, and the national poverty line, the one for Luxembourg, Germany, Spain, and all the other countries. So the first, the IPL, it's a very famous poverty line, the famous $1 a day that you may have seen around. I also heard school children talking about $1 a day. And in 1990, a group of independent researchers and the World Bank, they tried to come up with a common threshold that could indicate extreme poverty in the bottom, in the poorest countries of the world. And they looked at the numbers that the different countries were proposing to indicate poverty in their country. And these lines, of course, they were measured in terms of national currencies. So they needed a way to make them comparable. And one way, as we all know, to compare numbers that are expressed in different currency would be, for example, to use the exchange rate. But the exchange rate is not a good measure because it doesn't take into account the fact that with $1, for example, you can buy different items in one country and different items in another country. So what they did, instead of using simply the exchange rate, they used what is known as the purchasing power parity exchange rates. That is some numbers that allow you to transform all local currency in units that are comparable in terms of what you can buy. So the PPP exchange rates are constructed to ensure that the same quantity of goods and services are priced equivalently across countries. So the $1 a day came out as the result of the poverty line transformed, the local poverty line transformed with the PPPs in the 6 poorest countries of the world. So the 6 poorest countries of the world, they were measuring poverty in their country in terms of $1 a day using the PPPs in 1990. So, of course, the purchasing power parities, this PPP, they change over time, and this implies a revision of $1 a day. It was $1 a day when it was proposed in 1990. It became $125 a day when we use the 2005 PPPs. It became $1.95 in 2011, and now is $2.15. So this international poverty line is really the poverty line now, $2.15 in terms of purchasing power parities, that is expressing the poverty of those that are at the bottom of the income scale, so the poverty in extreme cases. So we want to have a quiz with you. And could you please tell us, let's look at extreme poverty in Luxembourg. So this $2.15 in the IPL. So could you please tell us what is the proportion, do you think, of the Luxembourg population that lived under the international poverty line in 1985? You can vote either with Slido, or you should see the voting coming out. Is it coming out? No. Yes? Philippe, I need your help. Just a second. We tried and tried 3 times. You're voting. Are people voting? Is everybody voting? No, Laurent says no.
Not in the chat.
Things are coming. Okay. It's working. Good. Okay, so we see numbers coming up, but the majority of you thought that 5% of the population in 2019 lived under the international poverty line in Luxembourg. And the correct answer, Philippe, we can stop. The correct answer is actually, sorry, let me get it. It's actually 0.1% in 2019. And in 1985, actually, we had 0% of the population in Luxembourg that lived under the international poverty line. So from 1985 to 2019, we have observed a slight increase of the proportion of the population in Luxembourg that is living under the international poverty line. But there is really very few people that are at that level of poverty. If we look in absolute number, only 627 individuals are in extreme poverty in Luxembourg. So we can clearly say that Luxembourg has no problem in reaching target 1 of Sustainable Development Goal 1 in eradicating extreme poverty. And Luxembourg is not alone, because all the rich countries in the north part of the world are doing very well in eradicate extreme poverty. This is not common. You can see in this map the number, the darker the color, the more the percentage of the population in extreme poverty in that country. So you can see that some of the poorest countries of the world in the south part, they really have a long way to go to eradicate extreme poverty by 2030. And a lot of progress has been done in the eradication of extreme poverty. Here we are showing numbers from 1990 to 2019, and you see that the share went from 35% of the population of the world to less than 10% of the population of the world. So a huge progress has been done to reach target 1 of Sustainable Development Goal number 1. And hundreds of millions, but the bad news is hundreds of millions will remain in extreme poverty in 2030 on current trends. This is a graph that comes from projections that were done by the World Bank. And the preliminary estimates were done even before COVID and before the war in Ukraine. So the projections are that we're not able to reach overall target number 1. Luxembourg will reach target number 1, but the world will not be able to eradicate poverty because we'll still have around 500 million individuals that will still be in poverty. And the reason why we reached such a decrease in the people in extreme poverty was because the majority of the poorest people on the planet lived in countries that experienced strong economic growth from 1990 to nowadays. And these were people primarily living in Asia. So you can see the incredible reduction of extreme poverty in South Asia, in East Asia, in the Pacific, but at the same time an increase in poverty in those living in extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. And what has happened with the COVID pandemic is that the step was done backwards. So the COVID-19 pandemic increased the global poverty rate sharply from 8.3% to 9.3%, rewinding progress by about 3 years. And we all know that after the COVID pandemic, we had the war in Ukraine that exaggerated the situation even further by rising inflation. So this combined crisis will lead to an additional increase of 95 million people living in extreme poverty by 2022 compared to pre-pandemic projection. And the situation is really very bad for low-income countries, with poverty reduction that has been set back by between 8 and 9 years. Okay, so the situation is not good at all. Overall, we're not going to be able to reach target 1. What about target 2? So these are income distributions, the log of the income distribution in different countries: Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Turkey, and the United States. And Luxembourg has an income distribution that is similar to that of the United States. All rich countries do. And what you can see is that when the country gets richer, the whole income distribution shifts towards higher level of income. It shifts towards the right. So if you put a poverty line, which is this dotted orange line of $2.15 per day, the international poverty line, you see that basically there are very, very few people that you capture in Vietnam, Turkey, and the United States. But there are a lot of people that you capture in poorer countries such as Bangladesh and Ethiopia. So Luxembourg has a poverty line, a national poverty line, which is much higher than the $2.15 per day. So let's go to the second quiz. I would like you to think about Luxembourg and the countries that are around us. So France, Germany, and Belgium. And I would like you to tell me the poverty line in these countries in 2021. So how many euros does one individual need to have in the year? Okay, now we're talking about years, not day anymore. In the year 2021, not to be considered poor in Luxembourg. Can you please vote? Is it working? Only one person? Or are you all, okay, things are coming up. Thank you for participating. Okay, 23 and 25,000 a year are on the top. Okay, so 18,000 a year is coming up now. 18,000 is coming up and it's staying up. 25 is getting closer, but still 18,000 a year. Okay, so this is your choice. 18,000, it's the majority of you. In 25 now. Okay, so 18 and 25. Okay, let's move to France. France, the majority is on 13,000. Belgium, you have 2 in the same position. In Belgium, you have 15,000 and 18,000. And Germany, the majority is saying 18,000. Okay, so what are the real number? The real number are the following. In Luxembourg, somebody is poor if in the year 2021 is not the poverty line is approximately 25,000. So this is what the majority of you said, even if a lot of you said 18,000, but the real numbers are 25,000. In France, you were right, is approximately 13,000. In Germany, you were wrong. You thought 18,000, but actually the number is 15,000. And in Belgium, we had equal a vote for 15 and 18, and the right answer is 15. So what are these national poverty line? The national poverty line are actually equal to 60% of the national median of income of the family adjusted for family size. So we take income of the household and we transform this income of the household, assigning it to each individual in the household with some complicated method that is known as an equivalence scale. And remember that this is 60% of the national median, and the median is that income that divides the income distribution in two, 50% as more and 50% as less. So because Luxembourg has a high median, automatically has a high poverty line, which is above 25,000. And if we look at the other European countries, we find huge differences in this poverty line because there are huge differences in median income among the countries. So we go from more than 25,000 in Luxembourg to around 3,000 euros in Romania, Bulgaria. And this is making redistributive policies within the EU complicated, because imagine how can we take from a rich, and give it to a poor if the rich is in absolute terms more poor than the poor we're going to give the transfer to. Okay, so the EU, together with this approach of relative poverty, is introducing also something absolute that is known as material deprivation, but we don't have time to talk about that. Now you're going to tell me, well, of course, but life is much more expensive in Luxembourg than it is in Romania, Bulgaria. You're right. So let's do the same exercise that we did before. And let's change these numbers in euros using the purchasing power parity. So these are numbers that are now comparable. You can buy the same items of goods and services in each country using the PPPs. As you can see, the Luxembourg poverty line in real terms goes down to above 18,000 in terms of PPPs. And the one of Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary is going up, but still there are huge differences in poverty among the European countries. So I'm done with my presentation. I'm going to leave the floor to Philippe, who's now going to continue and to tell us if Luxembourg will reach target 2 with its national poverty line.
Good, so let me share my screen now. Can you hear me and see my screen? Very good, thank you. All right, so now let's move on and sort of zoom into the situation of Luxembourg. And that really is all about target 2 of the SDG number 1. So target 2, remind you, it's by 2030 reduced at least by half the proportion of men and women and children of all ages living in poverty in all its dimensions, according to national definitions. And I emphasize national definitions, because that's obviously the other part of the story, the one which Conchita already introduced. So for target 2, we really dive in on poverty estimates for Luxembourg. And there's 4 things we want to look at. So of course, we need to understand national definitions, and that's what Conchita has already shown. So that's the first quiz. We can get a sense of what that means to be poor in Luxembourg according to the national definitions. Now, we still need to look at levels. So, well, how many people currently live in poverty in Luxembourg according to those national definitions. But SDGs are mostly about change and trends and improvements. So what we need to look at is, where are we coming from? Where are we heading to? And are we heading to reaching the targets, or are we just moving away? So we'll be looking at trends. And finally, target 2 insists a lot on the importance of having poverty reductions for all groups of people. And so we're going to look at briefly at population profiles and who are the people that we find in poverty in Luxembourg, and give you a quick overview of those different aspects. So as a sort of, before I say anything in terms of numbers, I think it's important to have a clear idea of where those numbers come from. And it's important to mention a word of caution here. So all of those estimates on poverty that we find for Luxembourg and for most European countries, and essentially for most countries in the world, are based on surveys, household surveys. In the case of Luxembourg, it's only residents, so we're not talking about cross-border workers and those sort of populations. So we're basing numbers on household surveys conducted in Luxembourg. There's different instruments. Currently what's being used is a survey called EU Statistics on Income and Living Conditions. That's something that's an EU-wide harmonized instrument. But it clearly has those limitations of surveys, is that some of the most vulnerable groups are not being well covered. The homeless typically would not be taking part in those surveys, so they would be undercounted. It's typically based on self-reported income information, which might be imperfect. There is sampling variation. These are large representative surveys, but they're never perfect. So any sort of poverty counts that I'm going to mention here are definitely estimates, and don't take them at face value. So we'll see it's going to be very important to look at long-run trends. And for that, we're going to use the Luxembourg Income Study, which provides some sort of a harmonized series on income that's covering almost 40 years of income data for Luxembourg. And we're going to see how useful that is to look in the long run. So, there's going to be adjustment for prices and cost of living and household composition. You'll have to bear with me that these tricky issues are taken care of properly. All right, so income poverty standards. We've already seen that this 25,000 euros gold rule. I think that's an easy one to remember. Compare them to other sort of income references to sort of get a clear idea of what that means. So the IPL that Conchita mentioned, $215 a day, the international poverty line, that would be 800 euros a year in Luxembourg. And then there's no surprise that there's hardly anyone below that number. So it's all based on relative income thresholds are based on a fraction of the median, so they are relative to the incomes in the population. And of course, this median is moving over time. So the threshold is going to change over time with the evolution of median income in the country. So here for reference, I'm putting the number in the starting point of the series, which would be about 15,000. So 60% of the median in 1985 would be about 1,500 euros, which is already 20 times the IPL currently, right? So that would be the median in 85. But of course, this median is going up over time. So in 2001, this was about 22,000 euros. So 50% higher than it was in 85. And now, heading towards 2019 in Luxembourg series, we're reaching this sort of 25,000 euros. So it's 25% higher further from 2000. So we see that already we have a moving target. So the reference is actually going up over time. So the objective of reducing relative poverty is to have low incomes grow faster than the target. So we need the targets going up, but we want to have the incomes of the poor people to grow faster than that target. For reference, what 25,000 means, it's very close to the Revis. The Revis is the minimum guaranteed income in Luxembourg. So annually, that would be for a single person about the amount of the poverty line. It's very similar to estimates of what static calls the reference budget. So it's essentially a measure of what it would cost for a household in Luxembourg to reach a normal living standard or minimal living standard. And it's actually not very far from the minimum wage. So the salaire social minimum, which would be sort of the lowest wage you could get if you work. And 26,000 is what the minimum amount you would get if you work full-time, full year. That's just above the poverty line. So if you work, you will be above the poverty line, but not by much. So this 25,000 is a kind of an easy to remember reference, and that corresponds to institutional numbers also. All right, so question is, how many people fall below that 25,000 threshold? And guess what? We have a quiz for you, which should be showing up if all goes well. Very good. So what do you think? Currently, 2%, 6%, 12%, 16%, or 20% of the population now fall below a national standard. So Conchita showed, well, there's almost no one below the IPL. How many people fall below the national poverty threshold? 60% of median income in 2019, that's about 25,000 euros in current prices. Right, we've got 6% has the lead. Okay, 6% clearly is the leader here. Okay, let's wait for 2 more seconds. 1, 2. Well, the winner is 6%. So where are we? Where's the truth lying? So let's look at this. Different threshold. The IPL, well, no one's below the IPL. 0%. Rounded, that's about 1,000 people. Now, if we were looking at the 85 threshold, well, the truth would be about 2%. So currently, there's 2% of the population that have an income below what would have been the threshold in 85. But if we move up, remember this reference has been going up. If we move up to the current standard, what we reach is actually 16%. So 10 percentage points higher than what you think. And 10 percentage points higher, in Luxembourg, it's 60,000 people. And interestingly, 16% is this interestingly round number. That means there's 100,000 people currently in Luxembourg that are identified as living in poverty, according to the national definitions of poverty. I mean, I think it's fair to say this is a large number. Of course, you will discuss whether these relative standards are appropriate, but that's what they are. So currently, according to those standards, we are 100,000 people living in poverty. Okay, high or low? I think what's important, again, getting back to SDGs, is what's the trend? Where are we heading to? So let's look back 35 years. 35 years, that's 85. So 85, according to both the 85 threshold or the relative threshold of that time, we had 9% in poverty. So that's a third, I mean, 1/3 less than we currently had. Okay, about 30,000 people. So heading up to 2019, so if we were keeping the threshold constant in 85, if we were not moving the target, we would be down to only 2%. But the idea of a relative poverty line is the target's going up along with median incomes. And if the target's moving up, currently we see that we have an increase and a significant increase in poverty, reaching 16%. And those contrasted trends, whether you look at the relative target, whether actually the target is actually going up versus a fixed target when things are left frozen in time, well, we clearly see the difference. So we start from 9% people in poverty in 85, and we are gradually going up and up and up to reaching about 16% nowadays. Most recent estimates have been 18%. But you see, there's variations over time, so it's important to look at the long term, the long view on those numbers, and not focus too much on variations year to year. But if you look at the long run trend, there's a clear increase in relative poverty. Whereas if we had fixed the threshold in 85, well, then the proportion of people in poverty would be actually very low and quite stable. So that's the contrasted trend. So first answer is, are we heading towards cutting poverty by half according to the national standard? Well, not at all. We're just going the wrong way. So that's lesson number one. Lesson number two is, is that true for everyone, or do we see improvements for some people, deterioration of the situation for other people? So let's look at some of the poverty risks for different groups of people. And we have a final quiz for you. And the quiz is now is slightly different. So the question is, imagine I give you one characteristic of a person, and you have to select which of the characteristics in that list would be the most discriminant characteristic or the marker of poverty. Let's say you want to identify who is most at risk to be in poverty, and you have one criteria to use. So it could be not having Luxembourg citizenship, could be being a woman, could be being above 65 years of age, not having tertiary education, not being employed, or having a child in the household. Which one of those would you think would be the most important marker in terms of determining the poverty risk? of the population. So what do you think? Is the poll active? Very good. Okay, very good. Again, interestingly, we have a clear favorite. So employment, 40% being employment, 22% having a child, being a woman, not having citizenship, and being above 60 years of age. Sorry, I don't see the numbers, but that's less. Okay, very good. Right, employment is still heading up. So let me wait for 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Answer is, well, I'm not going to give you the answer immediately. Let's first look at what it was in 85. So in 85, we had something that's very different from what you identified. Not being a Luxembourgish national was the most important marker in terms of identifying who would be most at risk of being poor. So if you pick up one characteristic, look at the nationality of the person. So having Luxembourg nationality. And then the second, we would have been old age. Actually being above 65 was an important marker of poverty risk. If you were Luxembourgish and above 65, that was also an important marker. And then the presence of children, as you rightly identified, was also an important driver. So moving up to 2019 now, what's going on? Has it all changed? Well, interestingly, not all that much for the main one. Not having Luxembourg nationality still is, in 2019, the most important marker of poverty risk in Luxembourg. Of course, we're not talking the causal effect of citizenship, etc. Obviously, it's a marker reflecting all sorts of different characteristics. But if you need to use one marker, citizenship would still be the most important. But no, beyond that, things have changed. So education is becoming important. Employment now is a more important marker of poverty risk than it was in the past. And now children have disappeared as the key things. The elderly have disappeared as a key population at risk, and we have more like young adulthood. Interestingly, gender is never appearing as a key marker. But remember, poverty is a household level concept. So everything's under the assumption that whoever lives with whoever in a household are sharing resources. So there's very limited scope for gender differences in resources, and that's not showing up in those numbers. Okay, just sort of to conclude now, we're going to look at the evolution of those poverty risks for some broad population categories, mostly driven by age, and see which of them is actually hopefully getting towards the SDG target, which is hopefully getting down towards cutting the poverty rate by half in 2030. So if we look at children, well, it's been increasing. Poverty risk has been increasing from just above 10% to just above 20%. So that's the increase. That follows the overall increase that we observe in the population. Younger adults, let's call them younger adults, same sort of thing. So the poverty risk has been increasing, and currently there's very little difference with the poverty risk of children. No, prime age people at work, that's probably the best protected population. So it's been going up. It's about 10% people at risk. 10%, you say, well, these people have a job. They still are in poverty, 1 in 10. That talks to the in-work poverty discussions and work by Luca Ratti. But that means that, remember, the minimum wage is not so much higher than the poverty line, and that's if you work full-time, full year. So there's scope for working and being poor. But of course, if you don't work, then the poverty risk explodes, especially for that age group. So the prime age adults, when no one's at work in the household, have a very high poverty risk, obviously. I know elderly, it's also going up. Elderly inactive also going up. So I mean, literally, there's no group where we are going towards the target. No groups except one group, which is going up next. It's the case of elderly household. So elderly household is the only group where we observe an improvement or reduction in their poverty risk. So the elderly was the most at risk of poverty in the 80s, and it's now becoming the group at least at risk of poverty. And that's the only group where we see improvements. So that's it. Let's conclude. So on the way to eradicating poverty, so target 1, eradicating extreme poverty, well, in Luxembourg, it's mostly yes. I mean, there's very, very few people below the extreme poverty lines. There's global progress, that's clear, but it's stalled in recent years, so the progress has sort of reduced considerably. But now if we look at the second target, which is now looking within the country using national poverty lines, well, clearly we are not getting there with the relative standards, but that's partly a good sign because the target's going up, which means median incomes are going up. So there's an increase in the sort of the middle standards, which is a good thing, of course. But that goes on with an inequality issue, which is that low incomes have not been growing as fast as the median. And that's the reflection of the increase in the relative poverty standards. And of course, look, one could cheat and say, well, let's look at absolute standards and fix the standards in 85, like the US do, and we'll obviously see a different picture. So that's it, ways forward. I mean, we want to reduce relative poverty. You have to have growth that lifts all boats, and especially lift the bottom. You want the bottom to actually grow a little faster than the medium, and that's what you want to have. Keep people at work, maintain high social protection. It's probably the obvious thing you'd want to do. And I think with that, we conclude. Thanks for your attention.
Is there any questions that we need to tackle?
Did I stop sharing the screen?
There is probably you can say something to, I already answered a little bit, but you may want to say something to Suzanne. So all statistics end naturally in 2019. You know that it takes time to collect the data, so we do not know what's happening now. But do you have any idea, I'm reading the chat, how COVID and the energy price crisis have affected the poverty trends?
That's an excellent question. So I should have mentioned that. I mean, those statistics are very low to appear and to be published. So so I'm focusing on up to 2019 because that's what the Luxembourg Income Study has. There's some estimates for 20 and 21. They don't show large changes. Poverty rates have been increasing further using the same sort of definition. COVID itself doesn't seem to have had a big impact on poverty. But of course, prices is a big thing. And what we observed in recent years is that the inflation has been growing faster than median incomes. So in real terms, we expect to see incomes falling. Now, the question is, has it been in real terms falling more for the bottom than for the median? That's a tricky question. And that's not one that's going to appear in those statistics because those statistics assume that everyone in the country faces the same set of prices. So the question is, if the prices of low-income individuals, so the prices of the goods that are being consumed by low-income individuals have been those that have increased most, and that's typically fuel, petrol, energy prices. And if there's more of that in the basket of goods consumed by poor people than there is in the median, then that reflects a deterioration in real terms of poor people. But that's not one that's going to be easily seen in the data. Now, estimates that colleagues at LISA have been looking at suggest that, in fact, there's not a very strong difference in the prices of baskets of goods consumed by poor people and the median in Luxembourg. That's not true in different countries, but apparently in Luxembourg, the baskets is not too big. So we see a decline in real terms, but if all incomes decline, the relativity kicks in, and you might have increases in poverty depending on the evolution of the poor people relative to the median.
I would like to add, then we move to the second question, but on this, COVID is a very good example, the beginning of COVID, of a reduction in inequality and also not increase in poverty, because remember that the poverty depends on the median income. And what happened during the first lockdowns is that the median income went down because the top of the distribution was going down. And so we observed a reduction in median income and the public policies that were very effective in supporting the bottom. So the inequality reduced with not much increase in poverty during the first lockdown. Then, of course, when the economy started to move again before the Ukraine war, then we observe an increase in the median because the top started to run again. Okay, we have a question from Alexandra.
Hello, I'm sorry, my computer started playing up. It wasn't a question, just started pressing itself. Sorry.
Okay, so that's not no, that's not a question. Let me see. We have here. How do other rich countries do on goal number 2, Philippe? Did some countries achieve goal 2, or will they likely reach it by 2030?
I don't have an accurate answer to that. I should look more closely to other countries. So something we didn't discuss is where Luxembourg stands relative to, let's say, European countries on those aspects. So Luxembourg typically is in the middle high, sort of in terms of relative poverty rates. So it has very high income standards, but that's all the point of this talk. It also means that the income threshold is pretty high. So in terms of relative poverty, it tends to be sort of more or less in the middle of the lot, and a little bit higher than this lot. I am not aware of any country that's achieving a strong marked reduction in relative poverty, notably because relative poverty is a concept that's really hard to achieve. You know, you really need to move up the poorest close to the middle, and you really definitely don't want the middle to go down. So I'm not sure any country is actually seriously reaching those targets than when using relative poverty definitions currently. But of course, I think in terms of absolute poverty, there's clear progress in pretty much all EU countries, I would say.
So there is a question by Paul on the US income distribution and the Luxembourg income distribution. The US is a very interesting country, Paul, because they follow what is known as an absolute approach to poverty. So the poverty line was set in it's much lower than it is in Luxembourg. It was set by in 1965. It was adopted in 1968. And it has been updated by then only by inflation. And the official poverty line in the US is for one single individual is approximately $15,000. So it's much lower than the approach that we use in Luxembourg because of this difference in thinking that poverty depends on the others around you, which is median income in your own country, or it's really an absolute concept that depends on the minimum amount you need to live an absolute decent life. And there is a huge discussion in going from one poverty line to the other. But of course, in Europe, we have decided that we're going to stick with the relative poverty line. The US is not moving to the relative poverty line. They have the national poverty line. But as I briefly said, this fact that now that we have such a big, such an enlarged Europe with countries with so many different income distribution, different median income, this approach is causing some issues because we cannot really redistribute from a rich to a poor if the poor is much richer than the rich in one country. So what in Europe we are doing is to adopt something that it is absolute, and it's comparing all Europeans in terms of having access to the same number of basic goods and services, and this concept is known as material deprivation. But we didn't have time to talk about that. And of course, when you look at material deprivation, probably I have a little slide on that. The result looks so different because you basically have no one in material deprivation in Luxembourg. where is it? I'm looking at, Philippe, in one of the first version of the slides, you remember we had the material deprivation comparing. Do you still have it on your computer?
Yes, if you take another question, I will look for that slide.
No, sorry, let me go.
So that you can keep going.
Let me go on I didn't look at the Okay, what country have seen the biggest improvement in fighting poverty as really the countries that experience growth? So we have China, we have India, we have the countries that really shift away from being poor country to being middle income and rich countries. So the East Asia and the Asia is really a success story over there. But we do not see any success story in countries in the African continent, unfortunately.
So so I see, just answering to a question of Suzanne on when you say, shouldn't be, so to your question, is the definition of poverty as the ratio of median the best way? Wouldn't it make more sense to make it defined related to a certain basket of goods? That's going to be connected to what Conchita is going to talk in terms of material deprivation. But interestingly, StatEx, so Static Statistical Office of Luxembourg, has conducted this exercise, actually, that you mentioned. They sort of come up with what would be a basket of goods that one would need to consume to live a decent life in Luxembourg. Of course, that's a complicated task. I mean, there's lots of normative judgments in what that should be. But, they sort of made this exercise and costed that. And interestingly, and it's one of the numbers I've shown, they ended up with a number which is very close to the current relative poverty line. So it seems that by the current level of the relative poverty, we do have criteria which are very similar to each other. But now, if you really zoom in on extreme poverty, basic goods, this is what I'm going to show in just a second, and Conchita will be able to comment.
Thank you, Philippe. I cannot find the old presentation we had at the time we cut because we didn't have enough time. Okay, so yes. Yeah, so this is the proportion of the population in the different EU countries that couldn't afford having access to these basic goods that are, Philippe, it disappeared.
Yes, I'm sorry. Bring it back.
Here it is. So all you...
Sorry.
Okay, so all Europeans are compared, they are looking at having access to at least 4 of the following items: pay their bills on time, keep their home adequately warm, face unexpected expenses, eat meat or fish or vegetarian equivalent regularly, taking a 1 week holiday away from home, having access to a TV, a washing machine, a car, and a telephone. Of course, if you do not want to have a car, you're not counted here. It's having access to. So you can rent a car, you can go by taxi. And if we compare all Europeans based to this basic access to these basic goods and services, we see that the situation is incredibly different, and Luxembourg is doing very well. So in terms of relative poverty, Luxembourg is doing not so well, but in terms of absolute material deprivation, we basically have very, very few in Luxembourg that cannot afford having access to basic goods and services. Thank you, Philippe.
You're welcome. So there was a question about, what do politicians say about that? We know, we don't know, we don't care. I think that's probably an area where European integration is actually very effective. I mean, there's at least reporting, there's monitoring, there's streamlining, there's coherence in statistics. So I think the European Union is bringing a focus that the country on its own might not be worried too much about. So there is certainly discussions of poverty rates, the evolution of poverty in policy arenas, and there's policy actions. So I think it would be unfair to say that politicians just don't care. There is indeed some political consideration about it. Of course, it's very complicated. I mean, if there was sort of an easy solution to address those poverty issues, one would apply it immediately. And it's sort of getting back to the point at the end. It's essential to have people at work because work-based employment is probably the best protection towards poverty. But at the same time, you need to have social protection. You need to have minimum income standards. And of course, there's all these incentives discussion. I mean, should we are we disincentivizing people to work if we are too generous in minimum income protection? Or do we have a problem of skills? I mean, should we really focus on skills and make sure people get access to better paying jobs? And there's always a trade-off in those discussions. And I would say Luxembourg is not doing too bad, but definitely more can always be done, especially if you look at the gap between, for example, the minimum wage and the poverty threshold. See, there's not much difference. So it hardly pays above the poverty line to work on the minimum wage. So what you really want to have people is actually not being working on minimum wage, but working at higher levels, possibly by their own skills. Yes.
Philippe, there was a question that Suzanne asked twice. How come that 1,000 people fall completely through all safety nets and live under the international poverty line in Luxembourg? Did you look at those? Why didn't they act? Because if you don't earn anything in Luxembourg, you can have access to all the transfers from the government. Did you have a look at who were those that didn't have access?
Yeah. So what in those statistics at the very, very bottom, people that you find are self-employed individuals or entrepreneurs that made losses. So these few numbers which have extremely low income, essentially that's because they have suffered losses in that year, and it turns out that their net income is actually zero, sometimes negative. So a good share of these very small numbers at the bottom are people like that. They have for a very short period of time, so on an annual basis, a very low income. That doesn't mean that they don't have accumulated any sorts of assets. So you might also think of, but that were sort of anecdotes of people who would have very large assets, but very low incomes. So a rich rentier would not be eligible for minimum income security because these are means tested. So if you have a lot of assets, you don't get social protection, social support. And those individuals in such statistics would appear as having extremely low income, but that might be compensated and extremely low income without social transfers because they have large assets on the side. So small numbers like that, I mean, can be looked at from those peculiar situations. I mean, you might also have students, young people living alone, so that are not eligible for income support because they haven't reached the age target, but they might be sort of living off the parent support, and cases like that are possible. And so the Ministry of the Family has recently conducted a census of the homeless, because that's of course, to some that looks like the elephant in the room. We're not looking at the right people. The extreme poor are not in our statistics. So what they did was run some sort of a census on one night. So they walked around the city of Luxembourg with NGOs, and they tried to actually count the number of homeless people in the city. And the number was just under 200. So we need to believe in that number or not, and we want to extrapolate that to the entire country, but we're probably talking, we must be talking less than 500 people. So at the scale of the country, that's in percentage. I mean, this is of course an important population, that's clear, but in terms of numbers, that's a small population, and one that needs very specific help.
And we have one last question. If we are expecting poverty to increase in the UK due to Brexit, yes. And they're not doing well at all on many fronts. So I think we do, but I haven't seen official numbers yet on that. Philippe, have you?
I haven't, but we probably expect the median to fall in the UK as well. I mean, we can expect an overall decline in incomes of the scale that's unknown, but But so we might observe that actually relative poverty in the UK is declining simply because those in the middle do more than those at the bottom. And that's a possibility.
But probably those at the bottom would be doing worse. And actually, we haven't talked about that at all because we are talking only about the percentage of, we've been talking about only the percentage of the population who's in poverty. And for us who are expert into poverty, we don't think that this is a good measure. It's a measure that is easy to understand, but it doesn't distinguish between those that are very poor to those that are just below the threshold. So we prefer to use measures based on the intensity of poverty, how much money you need not to be poor, how much money you need to reach the threshold. And in that case, you know, we would expect in the UK, the income of those at the bottom to go down. So the intensity of poverty would very likely go up, but we haven't looked at numbers. And this is a whole other story into the measurement of poverty with other indices, but it's not for today. Thank you.
So I think this is it. I think we went to all of the questions. If there are important questions that were not discussed, I will be sure that those questions are sent out to Conchita and Philippe. I would like to thank you both for this very informative and lively webinar on SDG1 and the concept of no poverty in Luxembourg. I'm glad also that we're able to, with this talk, to tackle sustainability from the point of view of social sciences. A systemic interdisciplinary approach is more than ever needed to make sustainability a successful reality. So I hope that you enjoyed the presentation and the Q&A session. The recording of the talk will be made available on the sustainability web pages of the university website in a few days. It's now time to end the talk, and I would like to already to invite you for the next Sustainability Lunch Talk that is scheduled on Tuesday, the 13th of June. Professor Dirk Zetsche from the Faculty of Law, Economics, and Finance will talk about the topics of regulations to achieve a sustainable approach to business. Please visit our intranet pages to see the program of the next talks and read the newsletters that my student assistant Moses and I have prepared on sustainability at the university. And I wish you all a very good afternoon. I'm closing the talk by thanking again Professor D'Ambrosio and Professor Van Kerm for their excellent talk. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Don't hesitate to reach out if you have any further questions.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Fluff.